Okay, welcome everyone. In a couple of hours, a certain Donald Trump will be sworn in as the 45th President of the United States. It somehow seems fitting then that we now move to a session on far-right populisms. We have three really terrific speakers who can help us understand this wave of reaction that we've seen over the past couple of years. Let me make some introductions. First up will be Professor Neera Yuval Davis. Neera is Professor of Sociology and Director of the Centre for Research on Migration, Refugees and Belonging here at the University of East London. She's the author of many books that you will be familiar with, most notably Gender and Nation, as well as The Politics of Belonging. She's just edited an important special issue of ERS around bordering and the Roma, which I would encourage all of you to search out. Next will be Dr. Aaron Winter. Aaron is Senior Lecturer in Criminology here as well in the University of East London. Aaron's played, I think, really quite a formative role recently as convener of the BSA Race and Ethnicity Study Group. He's also the coordinator of the Race, Ethnicity and Migration stream at the BSA annual conference. And he's currently working on a collection entitled Researching the Far Right. And then last but not least will be Gavin Titley. Gavin is Senior Lecturer at Maynooth University and co-author with Alana Lentin of The Excellent Crisis of Multiculturalism, as well as several articles mapping the changing form and content of contemporary racism. He's also got, I think, a forthcoming book due out called After Charlie Hebdo, Politics, Media and Free Speech. So, okay, if I can invite Neera to open up the conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. I have to apologize because I'm very fluid. This is why, unfortunately, I had to miss most of this very important and interesting conference. And thanks for mentioning this special issue of ethnic and racial studies, because all too often, especially in Britain, when we talk about racialized minorities, we forget to mention the grouping, which in all surveys in Europe always comes as the most hated one, which is the Roma. So I don't know how much our notion of Roma has come up in the conference until now, but I would encourage you to incorporate it into the analysis of racism and anti-racism. You mentioned Donald Trump inauguration, and it is kind of becoming a bit of a repetitive theme. But the last times I spoke on a somewhat similar theme. It was at a conference in Birmingham in the day when the Brexit results were announced. I just hope the next time will not be when Marine Le Pen will be declared the president of France. I've been asked to speak about far-right populism. Corbyn recently has started to encourage us all to talk about left-wing populism. I would like to argue very much against the notion of populism at all, whether right or supposedly left, at least in the way that what I understand what is populism. For me, what populism is what Michael Mann called the dark side of democracy. He invented this notion of the dark side of democracy in the context of the civil war in ex-Yugoslavia. And what he talked about is that when we reduce democracy to majority rule, there is a drive for homogenization and reification of boundaries, and this is why ethnic cleansing happens. And he wrote about it then, but if we talk about, listen to the debates on migration in Britain and in Europe as a whole, I don't know how many of you know that Marine Le Pen promised that if she becomes the president of France, children of migrants will not be allowed to attend state schools because the state belongs to us. And us is this homogenized notion of the national collectivity. However, this political project of belonging of us, as Peter Geshe and others have called it, autochthonic political project of belonging. The us is not, although citizenship status plays a very important role, and of course, color, religion, and other racialized boundaries, signifiers of racialized boundaries are very important. But autonomy is an even more elastic notion than ethnicity. Its only claim is that we were here before you, and therefore we belong and you belong. And the scale of it, of course, can be from the global to a single housing estate in Ganku. Peter Geshe called it the global turn to the local, and I'll come back to this thing in a minute. But I want to say a few more words on this kind of fascinating with populism, as if that what represents, as Donald Trump said last evening, all the forgotten people who are not going to be forgotten anymore. Of course, in a real democracy, people should not be forgotten. In the intersectional, anti-racist kind of ideology that we've been working on for a long time, we call for a intersectional dialogical epistemology which will inform who is us, not a so-called universalist homogenization that always leaves out the disadvantaged, the racialized, and the marginalized, but one which is informed by this dialogical epistemology. Many years ago, when I started to be a political activist, a Palestinian activist told me there is one litmus test to decide whether the politics of any revolutionary left or any kind of party is right or wrong. And this is what they say about minorities and what they say about women. And throughout all these years, this has always been a very important litmus test for my politics. There's been a kind of a debate or internal tension that we have to look critically when we look at issues of democracy and representation. On the one hand, we have the bottom-up movement, which, as I said, sometimes can be reduced to majority movement, which is about empowerment of the grassroots, about those who usually do not have a voice, which is very important. The other tension of top-down is of normative values such as human rights, of equality, of the fact of inclusiveness, and of giving rights to those who are not part of the majority. The reason I call it top-down is because people who believe in human rights and in this kind of value, even if they're isolated and nobody else accepts this value, says, I know I'm right, I'm going to fight for the rights of those who are excluded, disadvantaged, and so on. So in this sense, they don't have to listen to others. And this sometimes can be exploited, is if bottom-up movement can be exploited to this kind of populism, which is for ethnic cleansing. This top-out human rights kind of notion, and has been, for example, exploited by the so-called humanist interventionists in the wars of Afghanistan and Iraq and all this kind of thing, in order to liberate the people, they thought you don't need to listen to other people because we know what is right. Tony Blair is an embodiment of this kind of righteousness. So for me, democracy is not just bottom-up or top-down. For me, democracy is interplay between these two kind of tensions, listening in an intersectional way to a reality which can be understood only through a dialogical epistemology. I don't have, how much more time?
You've got 10 minutes.
Oh. Okay.
Don't make it all.
Well, that's good because all what I said until now is about what is far-right populism. What is more important, maybe, even than understanding the notion, is to understand why this populism is so popular now. Why it is as a result. And one thing that is important to understand is that it hasn't risen just in the north. It has arisen in the south and among racialized minorities in the south at the same time or even before. We have to understand that fundamentalist religious movements that have arisen in all major religions in the world are far-right populist movements in the same way that secular populist movements are now operating in the south. Although to call them secular is, of course, also a misnomer. Most of them are very much rely upon the Christian character of Europe. I just had to listen to the Hungarian public service. And in a way, this rise represents what Durkheim has called the pre-contractual norms which are necessary in order to establish any form of social contract. Because people need to believe that if such a social contract is going to be established, it's going to be kept. If you don't have this trust, you can have all the resolutions and the laws and the agreement, but they are not going to be kept. And what is this, the disillusionment that has contributed so heavily to Brexit and Trump and the rise of the far right everywhere, is part of the breakup of this pre-contractual trust. And this is due to what I've been calling in my work in the last few years, the double crisis of governability and governmentality, which has happened under neoliberal globalization. We are now not only have the inauguration of Trump, we also have the annual event of Davos. What is Davos? Davos is the center of real governability in the world these days. Because under neoliberal globalization, governments cannot anymore represent the interests of their citizens. They have to negotiate with the multinationals in order to see how they can coexist. And the power of the multinational, it started with laws that have given companies, LTD, the same identity as people, and it moved to the, although TIPP itself was defeated, even worse, and especially post-Brexit Britain, version of it are being passed, in which multinational companies would have the same legal status as government and even can sue governments if for some kind of, for example, health and safety regulation, they would say you are disturbing our proper ability to have profits and work in things. So the role of the executive in governments becomes have become much stronger than that of the legislative, especially with the privatization of the welfare state. And this executive focusing on negotiating with these multinational interests. This is why people think voting doesn't matter anymore. Anyway, it's going to be the same. And it indeed is the same because people found themselves under all these kind of constraints. I'm not that big fan of Obama, but I do believe that if he did not have these constraints, he could have done more than what he's done. And the most extreme example is what happened in Greece with Syriza, a radical party that really wanted to represent the interests of all its citizens, was not able to do it, and basically oversee the enslavement, there is no other word of enslavement, with the privatization of the Greek state. This crisis of accountability have led to the crisis of governmentality in the Foucaultian sense. Because as he mentioned, under neoliberalism, the governmentality was people saying you are responsible for your health, for your well-being, for your success. If you don't succeed, it's your own fault. At a certain point, people stop buying this bullshit, if you see it like that. This is why people have become so disillusioned. And people say, anybody who pretend to be establishment, anybody who pretend to be caring for us, or to represent us, we don't want to be an expert on how to do things. We don't believe them. And this is a space where people are turning into to find other anchors of safety. So Donald Trump is talking about building a high wall in which all the Muslims and the Mexicans and all the other undesirable will be thrown out. Israel, country I come from, such a wall already exists. It does not make the people inside more homogeneous, nor does it make them feel safer. This is an illusion. But these are physical walls, the metaphorical walls of racialized boundaries, of autochtonics, politics of belonging. This is what people come to try to land in. This is our people. This is us. This is all what we are left of. You know, they were talking about the risk society. They were talking about in which you cannot be sure that you'll have the same job, that you'll live in the same place, or even you'll have the same family throughout your life cycle. So what is not changing? Not changing is to whom you are born, what religious origin you have been, and of course, this is our place. We belong here. All these things, of course, are social constructs, but this is what people are holding on to, and this is what makes the power of this far-right populism so strong. And left-wing populism is not going to establish an alternative if it retains the notion of populism of us, the people. Because the most problematic notion is us. Because there is always assumed them and the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nira. I know you're not well, so double thanks. Now we've got Aaron Winter.
Thank you. I'm not including my time. I just want to clarify. I'm a co-convener of the BSA Race and Ethnicity stream and co-editor of the book. So I want to share the responsibility as well as everything else. Okay, this presentation will be on the relationship between the far right and mainstream racism, including Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism, and xenophobia, and attempts to associate and disassociate them in the context of Brexit and, I'll give a little nod to Trump because, today. When Labour MP Joe Cox was murdered by Thomas Mayer on 16th of June, I thought it could be seen as a symbolic culmination of the implications of all the hateful, polarized, scapegoating rhetoric of the EU referendum, and that leading up to it. And a watershed moment when a nation, an electorate divided, reflected on itself. Well, just one side. The fact that Mayer allegedly shouted, Britain first, this is for Britain, Britain will always come first. That's from the court transcript. As he confronted and shot Cox, a Remain campaigner and champion of refugees, and, really importantly, the context, seemed to confirm the link between the referendum and particularly Brexit rhetoric. The use of Britain first led the far-right group of the same name to deny responsibility, yet an image of Mayer campaigning for the group soon emerged. In addition to links to Britain first, Mayer was found to have a range of white supremacist neo-Nazi material at his home, and is alleged to have purchased material from the US-based National Alliance, infamous for being led by the late William Pierce, who wrote the Turner Diaries, which influenced the Oklahoma bomber Timothy McVeigh, as well as a lot of neo-Nazis in Aryan nations during the 1980s. The novel has returned to the spotlight in the wake of Trump campaign and a revival of the far right in the US. Something that has been linked to the right-wing populism, racialization, and mobilization of the white, allegedly working class as the people, the allegedly white working class anger, racism, and xenophobia, and the convergence between the mainstream and far right that fed Brexit, which Trump calls great. He used great, I think, 3 times in one sentence, but I'm not a linguist. Yet little or nothing was reflected on or changed. As it often does, a link to the far right can be used to confirm political, ideological, and discursive preconceptions and fulfill political, ideological, and discursive functions. When a case of far-right violence occurs, politicians, the media, and the public, as well as some academics, are quick to paint a picture of an individual or fringe movement that has stepped outside the boundaries of reasonable, rational, democratic discourse and practice to espouse extremist views and use violence, thus definitely not linked to any particular campaign, political party, or popular sentiment. Often the individual in question is described as a mentally unstable loner, as Mayer has by Nigel Farage. To quote, one man with mental health issues. And I think this really confirms that it's not just the mental health psychopathologization, it's always the identification of an individual. The statement one man is really important. Spite the Daily Mail and wider right-wing media also do this. This depoliticizes the actor and act. I don't think I'm telling anyone in this room anything they don't know. From the far right and mainstream, as well as wider forces and structures. It is important to note that the individualization and psychopathologization of the extremists also, unlike in the case with Muslims, separates them even from a wider movement. But Mayer demonstrated that a psychological and political reading and reality can coexist. On a side note, on the trial for the attack on and murder of 9 at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015, Dylan Roof rejected the psychological defense. He was unwilling to accept what the media was throwing at him. As he argued, psychology was a Jewish invention, making them mutually exclusive or conflated in terms of psychology and his own politics. Mayer had clear far-right political beliefs and links, identifying himself as a political activist, and both this and mental illness were lines of police inquiry, despite claims across social media that it was only mental illness that was targeted. This individualization and exceptionalism based on mental illness or lone wolf designation, the political equivalent, also deracializes the actor and act, allowing those like him or her to not have to identify, allow them to distance themselves, provide a collective alibi, and even apologize, as Muslims are frequently asked to do after a terrorist attack. As Mayer's act was committed in the name of Britain against foreigners in the context of a campaign where Muslims have been targeted for not integrating as refugees and ironically as extremists and terrorists, and that he had an association with Britain first, the racial double standard and irony are obvious. Unfortunately, the label of terrorist, which many have called for, particularly white terrorist, is rarely enough to break apart the racist discourses and structures. For one thing, the focus on and language of extremism and terrorism ironically feeds off the same Brexit fear-mongering and racialization and distracts from the mainstream hate whipped up by it. To call it extremist is to buy into partly the prevent discourse, the Brexit discourse, etc. For another, despite Brexit's claims of white victimization and the decline of Britain by both the far and mainstream right, the racism and xenophobia whipped up sits atop entrenched underlying structures and institutions that maintain related white privilege and racial inequalities, and these play a role in the double standard. It has to go beyond language. In an unironic and confused example of the double standard, when Britain first distanced themselves from the mayor shooting, as if they think collective guilt by association with terrorism is a bad thing, leader Paul Golding actually linked his statement not to the group, but to the wider Brexit campaign in context. To quote, when this person said, was he referring to an organization? Was he referring to a slogan? Was he just shouting in the middle of the EU debate? Putting Britain first, you know, I've heard this almost every day. Unlike Brexit supporters and leaders, neither Trump nor his supporters thought it urgent or important to distance themselves and the campaign from the resurgent far-right and so-called alt-right when they received endorsements from David Duke, the Ku Klux Klan, Aryan Nations, American Nazi Party, Stormfront, and Richard Spencer, so-called founder of the so-called alt-right. That's a whole other debate. Not to mention gateway figures from Breitbart, the gateway drugs for the mainstream. His response was, this is Trump, I don't know anything about what you were even talking about with this white supremacy or white supremacists. I don't know the endorsement or what's going on. Because I know nothing about David Duke. I know nothing about white supremacists. Well, he'd already called for bans on Muslims, walls, fascist registries, and would later retweet far-right activists and networks. Despite this, all this, and being endorsed by the Klan, it was Farage's support, which was highlighted by Clinton as an example that Trump is an extremist. It reverses the historical trend where British media tends to think of the Americans as the racists and extremists. With the exception of Jobling, most Brexit Leave activists and commentators seem intent on making the mayor killing about exceptional extremism. Their response was twofold: disavow mayor and disavow those making the links. Particularly Remain commentators putting the murder in the context of increasing polarization, inflammatory tone, and fear-mongering of the debate from the Leave campaigns, as well as wider social forces and sociological factors. According to Polly Toynbee, this campaign has stirred up anti-migrant sentiment that used to be confined to the outposts of the far fringes of British politics. And Daniel Trilling, far-right politics cannot be easily cordoned off from the mainstream, as people would like to believe. Fascists attach themselves to popular causes and drag the debate in their direction. Populists and parties of the center take note and then try to appeal to voters susceptible to the far-right's messages. In response, some such as Douglas Murray, who we all know of, and Brendan O'Neill of Spike, argued this was opportunistic, exploitative, and anti-democratic. To quote from O'Neill, the spirit of democracy was dealt two blows yesterday. First came from a warped killer, again articulating the deranged loner discourse, Thomas Mayer. The second from the ghouls of the media and political classes, who swiftly blamed the murder on the Brexit lobby. And who have marshaled Cox's death to the cause of sanitizing political speech and insisting certain views can no longer be expressed. The argument seemed at once to displace racism and hate and justify its expression. In fact, the argument that free speech and democracy are being repressed not only echoes those arguments that say the reason we are here, Brexit, is because we have not been allowed to democratically talk freely about immigration for fear of being labeled racist, blaming political correctness, anti-racism, and New Labour for political correctness, anti-racism, and immigration, as well as abandoning the working class. Some blame Tory austerity, but it seems like the libertarian sort of Lexeter and the right blame New Labour. Some for allowing all these immigrants in and being multicultural, and some for closing the door and not representing the working class, the left working class. Now, this discourse coming from Murray and from particularly Spike and things like that, I would argue are part of a backlash that was part of the mainstreaming normalization of this racism. It was the gateway. Only 5 days prior to the vote, O'Neill claimed hate speech is free speech, reiterated after the vote, showing that democratic speech seems to be limited to hate speech. I would argue that the tone of the campaign and the far right and links between them can also be seen in the context of the wider normalization of racism, anti-immigrant xenophobia, Islamophobia, and racialized nationalism in mainstream politics, media, and I guess public discourse as well. They've been developing since the financial crisis, fed into the referendum, and were intensified by it. Sorry. What we have seen is the mainstreaming of the extreme, informing an emboldening and a radicalization of the mainstream, and a further emboldening and radicalization of the far right. Britain has now produced a paramilitary American-style far right, and someone, even if just inspired, has already taken a life. Just prior to the murder, Britain first ran a paramilitary survival training camp in Wales, and on 17th of June, a day after the murder, issued a threat against Sadiq Khan and all Muslim elected officials. This week, Jobling threatened MPs and journalists on the day of his release from prison. So they were not overly concerned with the stigma of violence. Farage certainly appealed to fascism and appealed to the far right. He claimed a Cologne-style sexual assault by refugees is likely if Turkey joined the EU and Britain stayed in, and his Leave.eu released that famous poster, that Nazi-esque poster of refugees coming not into Britain but from Croatia to Slovenia in 2015, with a banner reading "Breaking Point." The campaign also targeted far right on social media, and Farage met with English Defence League members. He seems to see the white British, and particularly the far right, as a people, victims of injustice, with righteous anger and the capacity for violence. I say that because in a May 2016 NBC interview, he said, "It's legitimate to say that if people feel they've lost control completely, and we have lost control of our borders completely as members of the EU, and if people feel voting doesn't change anything, then violence is the next step." Returning to that opposition I drew up earlier between the individual extremist who commits violence and reasonable, rational, democratic discourse and practice, what is clear here is not only is the line blurred, in Farage's own words, but a democratic election referendum is constructed as a way of preventing or just delaying violence, which will occur should democracy not find favor in one side. When I was, my first job, I was living up in Scotland, and there was a referendum that had to do with the allocation of a certain garden public space to an oil company, and the referendum was won by the public. It was overturned, just like the Trump golf course. One of the leaders of the campaign for the oil magnates, little partner in Alabama, recorded 1,094 attacks, the majority in the first week and a half. Here, even the police, all European embassies, etc., Talmama have all recorded growth. In the U.S., Southern Poverty Law Center has also noticed this spike, and they've noted a connection between the campaigns where Vote Trump and Make America White Again have been spray painted on black churches, mosques, synagogues, etc. Now, I would just say, Make America White Again and Make America Great Again aren't that different. It's clearly nostalgia for a Jim Crow, pre-civil rights era. No kidding, the Klan is back. As much as Brexit plays on nostalgia, not merely for empire, and I sort of disagree with this idea that it's a nostalgia for empire. I think the post-colonial melancholia is also it's very much a nostalgia for a Powell-esque moment. One in which the nation was small, the sky was falling, and racism was allegedly acceptable. There's a ressentiment that's going on there, that that the complaining and the anger, free from allegedly political correctness, is what is also desired. Now, I'm just going to finish up by saying that there seems to be growing evidence between the link between the campaign and hate crimes. Yet the response from some Brexiters has been threefold. One, deny and denigrate. Daily Mail gave some statistics, rejected them because Britain is tolerant, Sadiq Khan, evidence, and hate crime is a cynical industry. Brendan O'Neill referred to it as hate crime hysteria designed to delegitimize democracy. Secondly, racialize the working class, divide and rule, and reverse the racism. Spike Luke's Gittos claimed that the onset of panic has revealed how the very publications and commentators once claimed to stand up for the working class, in fact view them as violent racist horde, thereby assuming the working class are white, the people and the nation, much as the BNP, now Britain First and UKIP have done. And they are also Brexiters, and they are also the alleged perpetrators of violence. It seems that every time someone claims racism is on the rise, the populist defenders of what they construct as the white working class assume it is them being accused, assume a racist campaign speaks to them because they all have been left behind, and only people who are white are left behind, and repressed by anti-racism and political correctness, and attribute the success of the campaign to them and attack others for making that link. This is clearest when O'Neill says Brexit voters are not thick, not racist, just poor, and states that Britain's poor and workless have risen up, failing like Gittos and others to consider other constituencies who voted for Brexit, the political heterogeneity of the poor and workless and voting abstention. And according to Danny Dorling, 52% of people who voted to leave lived in the southern half of England, and 59% were middle class. Although this should have been expected considering white flight to Kent and Essex historically. In the US, it's been shown that Clinton actually lost more white working class votes than Trump gained from Romney. And along with him losing the popular vote, I think we need to contest this sort of sometimes well-meaning but often not idea of the people and the working class vote. Thirdly, sophistry and selective time travel. If we see such attacks as post-Brexit, it means we deny it existed previously. Racism, that is. Gittos claimed Britain has not become racist overnight, and Joanna Williams claimed, as if exposing a lie, the EU referendum hadn't even happened before it led to an increase in hate crime. Yet scapegoating and hate was a factor in pressure in the lead up to the referendum anyway. And racists have become emboldened. You would think Gittos was highlighting pre-existing or structural racism. Yet for years spiked his attack to anti-racism on the grounds that it's not as bad as what I was growing up in the 80s. To quote from O'Neill, there's a great disparity between the hand-wringing over hate crime and what Britain is actually like. The open racism, even I can remember in the 80s, has all but vanished. Racist chants at football matches are a distant memory. The likes of the BNP and EDL have withered due to a lack of interest. And Farage, I destroyed the British National Party. We had a far-right party in this country who was genuinely anti-Jew, anti-black, and all those things. And I came along and said to their voters, you're holding your nose and voting for a party as protest. Don't. Come vote for me. I'm not against anybody. I just want to start putting British people first. And I almost single-handedly destroyed the far-right in British politics. They can't seem to recognize that all this was aided by the far-right and the normalization and the mainstreaming of their ideas. In addition to hate crimes, we've had a lot of policy initiatives that stink of fascism, proposing lists of foreigners, child refugees being subjected to medical tests. And this is just seems to be getting worse. I would just, on a note, as Seth was asking, it's just worth noting that, in post-Brexit Britain, the category of people, which is an ever-decreasing category, an ever-specific category, now even white British judges can't get included. Farage is marching on the judiciary with the EDL and BNP. Trump is president-elect. I was trying to say president, yeah. That wasn't a watch. Racist incidents are on the rise, and the Klan is celebrating, and he hosted Farage. I'm just not sure, speaking of the far right, what Trump's revolution fetishizing militia supporters feel about this Brit, nor what working class populists think of the gold lift they were pictured in. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Aaron.